Go for it. Right, I'm Chris. I'm here to talk about different ways of improving lectures. When I first looked into it, I was really surprised at just how little psychology you've done with this, as I will explain with the research. Here, Knight and Wood had used an hour less in their biology undergrad course, and instead they used different types of workshops, and they found that just by switching it up a little, that it improved the learning. They found that learning gains, which is improvement in scores, and difference between pre and post test, which they also showed a better conceptual understanding as well. Freeman, as well as other studies, again with the biology students, were given regular active learning exercises, their grades would increase. Again, you may notice a trend that this is a lot of biology doing this and not psychology. And again, Hackett et al. Found that a highly structured course involving daily and weekly practice with problem solving, data analysis and other high order cognitive skills. I've used that term because that's the term they use within the study. Really that is metacognition. They just don't realise it, probably because they aren't psychologists, these are biology lecturers. They found that by improving their metacognitive skills, the socioeconomic background of the students became less of a factor in their performance. Another study used cognitive psychology principles. This is the first one I came across which actually used psychology principles in improving lectures. They found that they could do this on a large scale. 271 students, so it is possible to do it on a large scale. It doesn't have to be a small course. You can do this in our course. Yeah. And again, another study found that students better understood concepts after discussion with peers. They found this using a clicker system when in lecture, we've used it before, they'll have clickers, so the lecturer will ask you a question, so you put in like which answer you want, it's multiple choice. They found that by using that system, it actually improved the learning experience. Even if none of the students within a peer group knew the answer, they would then discuss it with their friends after putting in the answers, and then between them would come to the right answer. And whereas if they were doing it on their own, they wouldn't have got there. So this is a good example of peer discussion being used in a lecture. Again, I've explained this as a surprising lack of psychologists doing this research. There was just one of those studies that had one psychologist as a principal researcher. You know, there's clearly a need out there for lectures to be improved, and the lecturers have failed. Not failed, they've given up on psychology providing the answer and are looking for it themselves. I mean, frankly, that's embarrassing for psychology. We're the ones who are meant to study how people learn. We're the ones who are meant to then explain it to others, and they're not listening because we're not giving them the answers and they're finding it on their own. To me, like, shouldn't we be doing this? And here's a triangle which I think everyone has seen. There can be criticisms of this, like the percentages not being right, or in different circumstances the levels can switch, but generally it's quite a good way of looking at it. And you can see how lectures are right at the top, whereas teacher there's right at the bottom, which is obviously why we're doing this today. But then I thought about this, and is really giving mini lectures while teaching each other the best way to do this? I'm not sure, which is why I'm planning something special for my final talk, but you'll have to wait for that. So going into the way, I found that there are 5 different ways of improving lectures. The first one is active learning, which I think a lot of people have heard of. It's been talked a lot about. It's very similar to what James is talking about in student engagement. It could generally be defined as any instructional activity that requires students to do meaningful learning and think about what they are doing. Common activities include debating topics, role-playing, analysing and reacting to videos. So it's about taking a moment to really think about it rather than just someone just keep talking at you, which is what I'm doing to you now, but yeah. Again, research has suggested that discussion is more effective for the retention of material. So if you doesn't have to be sitting there, but if you think about something new, then you have to reply to that, and you then take the discussion in new directions, that you will retain more information that way than just, sitting in a lecture hall, However, evidence for active learning is weak, and McKeachie himself admits that. However, he says the amount of literature out there saying that it works, does make a compelling case that maybe it's not as effective as some people believe, but he does say that it's effective. There's just not one experiment which will definitively prove that. Yeah. Again, the saying that for active learning it's best if you mould the teaching around the material, which is almost like student-centred, but it's material-centred. So it depends on the material and how you should deliver it is the best way to teach it. Student-centred is, as it sounds, it's you mould the material around the student and how they learn. So if learning styles, a bit debate, they don't really work, but if people prefer, discussion, for example, I think they might prefer that, and it would engage them more if they're enjoying it, rather than in other methods if they don't enjoy it. Okay. Collaborative learning involves the principle that learning occurs best in groups. In literature, there is confusion between collaboration and cooperative, where generally they're the same thing, but some researchers will define them separately depending on what they are doing. Collaborative learning has several benefits, including being more dynamic and motivating, encourage students to research their knowledge and understanding of concepts. Again, this is trying to engage the students, not just like talk at them. The research suggests an individual's academic performance would increase slightly. However, there would be a large increase in the retention of information, which, if you want to argue about multiple choice exams that we have at this university, where there's no retention of information, once you leave that exam hall, you forget it all. That's not really the best way to learn. This way is almost the opposite. You retain more. Yeah. Experiential learning encourages students by involving them in activities that allow them to experience it. A good example of this on our course would be when we got to hold the human brains. Obviously we could actually see what we were talking about when it came to the ventricles and all sorts. Again, field trips. Faye took us, there was a couple she did. Went to a conference in London, or I went to Krakow with her. It was a fantastic trip. That is one example of experiential learning. And to show how it does engage, you can see how it can almost engage the entire brain. Different areas, it all relates. That's how this system works, because it gets the whole system working, and that engages people. Yeah. Problem-based learning is again metacognition. You give them the beginning of the instruction to provide context for what you're seeing. So you give someone a problem, and then you explain how to solve it, and that way when people look at what you're saying, it gives them context and why it's important, which is which help them engage in it and try and think more rather than just, sit there and listen and they just glaze over. If you give them context, they will engage more. Whether in small groups, again, group activity will help learning. And this is all ways that problem solving will improve people, give them adaptation, participant in change, creativity and critical thought. If you sit there in a group, again, not everyone will have the answer, which goes back to the clickers in the lecture. You bring everyone together, they can start bouncing off ideas, and that's how you get creative and critical thought, successful team collaboration. Well, we're here to learn, and in the workplace, you will have to work with other people, and this is a life skill that we should be taught. That's why that's helpful. Leadership skills, again, if you want to go into management or anything like that, this sort of thing will help. Okay, so what Slavovich and Zimbardo thought was, well, these systems actually are more similar than different. At the centre, for example, of active and student-centred learning is the concept of cognitive dissonance, which is how it conflicts with your existing knowledge, and then you have to try and reason how it would actually fit in. And it's that reasoning within yourself that help you learn and help you retain the information. Again, to encourage the cognitive dissonance needed, the student needs to engage in it, which again, active learning or experiential learning can do. And they came up with this system here. Transformational teaching, which they based on several psychology principles, and that is what they're championing. As you can see, it was released last year. So psychology are doing something, they're just not applying it. And as I go back to when I started talking about how biology and physics lecturers were doing their own research, there's clearly a need. And psychology doing the research but doing nothing with it. So again, we have researched how people learn and created a model to teach, but no application. I do find this really embarrassing. How can you try and claim to be a science? How can you claim to help people when you don't apply what you preach? Really baffles me, I'll be honest. So thanks for listening. Any questions?
I just wanted to say something. Curious that you would give a whole talk about innovation in teaching, and not mention whiteboards or PowerPoint or technology.
It can help. Technology obviously will help.
But it seems like most people who are in education would suggest that innovation is all about technology. And I think from what you've said, that's not actually true at all, that innovation involves theoretical principles and what underlies teaching and learning.
Yeah, well, I would definitely argue that. Technology can help, but it doesn't matter if you're looking at a blackboard, a whiteboard, or a PowerPoint slide. You are still just sitting there having someone talk to you. That doesn't matter. The innovation comes from how people teach you, not what with. Anyone else? No?
When you say motivation is a big part of education,
yes,
and that these sort of areas are going to help motivate kids to be better and be more interested in the subject.
Yeah.
Like my blog this week's about motivation in education, and it's very similar. It's quite funny. There's sort of a lot of parallels between the study I looked at and these. So it's like education, maybe the psychologists are maybe starting to think about this and actually are getting it. Because my paper's from 2009. It's quite amazing how it's started to move forward.
Yeah, it is. And when you go back to like the research I talked about, biology and physics, that's from the early 2000s. This is before psychology started to look into it, and they're not just looking into it, they're adapting their course and seeing the results. So they're actually doing something with it, whereas psychologists are just like twiddling their thumbs, sipping their whiskey, talking about it. What, you know, it's all great. Well, yeah, but this class is the exception to the rule. If you look back to our second year, you know, how many modules were different, other than Franz and research skills, every module was the same: midterm, final, and a 500-word essay. Every single module the same. How is that adapting the course to the material or to the student? The innovation just isn't there.
Another interesting question is how many can remember half the things you learned last year?
Exactly.
Honestly, don't remember any.
No.
Time? Time.